Make sure I'm not standing in the way of the screen. Hi, I'm Lucy Beednell. I work at the ARC of Northern Virginia, and as Eileen mentioned when we kind of kick things off here, I'm going to be talking a lot about Medicaid waivers today, but they are intersecting increasingly with some other pieces of Medicaid. So we're going to talk about Medicaid waivers and then how they intersect with CCC Plus Managed Care and this EPSDT program and some other changes that have been happening in the Medicaid realm. So we'll kind of work through everything. The caveat I usually give is that this conversation is not perfectly logical and linear because waivers are not perfectly logical and linear. So I usually say, unless you're asking for me to clarify something that I just said, just hold your questions until the end because most times I get to them. And if I start taking questions, then we like veer way off what's already a complicated topic. So definitely, I thank you to Eileen for printing handouts, like make notes all over it, of course, save questions, write them down. And if you have anything that you need me to like repeat as we go along, let me know. I tend to talk pretty fast, but I also repeat myself a lot, and I'll constantly say, like, remember when we talked about this before, and this is how it relates to this kind of thing. So you'll hear the same kind of things on repeat. Hopefully you'll leave here with me like drumming around in your head. Waivers, waivers, waivers. All right, so we'll go ahead and get going here. All right. So quickly, the ARC of Northern Virginia is a sister chapter to the ARC of Loudoun, and all ARCs have the same mission, which is making sure people with developmental disabilities have great inclusive lives in their homes and communities. Beyond that, a lot of what our chapter does is tons of education, information, and referrals. So lots and lots of workshops, webinars, guidebooks, toolkits, one-pagers, rapid response information referral portal, all those kinds of ways to get information out to people. So if you ever have questions or see a need for a resource or a workshop, let us know, and that's the kind of thing that we love to do. We have case managers on staff who work for people who use some of the waivers, so we are very closely acquainted with the waivers. We have a public guardianship of last resort program. We serve just a few dozen people in all of Northern Virginia who either have a developmental disability, mental health, or aging-related disability and have no one in their life who can serve in that role. We have a special needs trust, and we'll talk a little bit about that as it intersects with Medicaid and the waiver program. And we have a beneficiary advocate on staff who's effectively the privately hired hand that you can have on board if you say, like, all of this or all of anything is too overwhelming. Someone needs to come help me come up with a plan and do these things either with me or for me. Okay, so to give you a little bit of a flavor of how the flow of things are going to go, I'm going to talk a little bit kind of about waivers at a ground level. So what's their purpose? What is the basic understanding of what a waiver is? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the waiver system was redesigned in 2016 and 2017. Then from there, we're kind of going to get into the nitty-gritty. So how do you know if you're eligible for waivers? What services do they offer? How do I apply? If there's a waiting list, what's it like to navigate through that? And then we're going to talk about these kind of intersecting pieces I mentioned. So one of those is going to be managed care, the CCC Plus program that Virginia has moved towards. One of those is going to be this CIS and this change in budgeting for people using the waivers. And the third is going to be that EPSDT program that I mentioned. And that's got some very big changes going on that are happening right now. So again, starting off with purpose and description of the waivers. So generally speaking, waivers allow states to fund services in community-based settings, meaning places that everybody else lives, instead of having people with a developmental disability have to live in a hospital or institutional setting in order to receive help. All waivers are Medicaid waivers, so mostly I'll just say waivers. You know, it's just a little bit easier to say, but Medicaid because Medicaid is the program that funds the waivers, meaning you have to have Medicaid to get them. Bills are sent to Medicaid and they pay people back for waiver services, and Medicaid writes the rules and writes the contract for the waiver, so they do a lot of the overseeing and management. The waiver, I get the question about this a lot, it's a quirky term. It essentially means if the state's going to offer something through Medicaid, usually the state has to offer it to everybody who has Medicaid. That makes sense, right, for the sake of fairness. But states can be given a waiver of that requirement. They can say, oh, we want to set aside extra services for a certain group of people who have extra needs. So in this case, we'll be talking about the additional needs people with developmental disabilities have and the additional services that Medicaid can offer to them. All right. Why do we look at waivers, especially given all these caveats I've given you about how long and complicated this is, and there are waiting lists and all these things? Well, there are a few good reasons. In Virginia, in particular, they're meant to be a one-stop shop for people with developmental disabilities across a lifespan. So if you need help in your home as a child, if you need help on your job as an adult, if you need nursing care at any point in life, they're meant to have all those kinds of things and to flex with people as they age and grow and change. They're there for people, like I said, across the lifespans. Once you have it, generally speaking, people keep them for the rest of their lives, so long as they continue to be eligible. This is critical. They're the only public funding stream for ongoing support services. So let's break that down. That essentially means waivers are your only answer for free or very, very low cost services that are there for the ongoing future. So there are some programs that can offer you help at a cost, and there are some programs that can offer you help free but for a short period of time. Waiver is the only one that's free and there for the ongoing period of time. All right, here's a little bit of background that I think is important to understand with Medicaid waivers. So it's a 50-50 state and federal partnership for funding. Every state in the country has some version of the waiver, and every state in the country splits the funding with our federal government. In Virginia, like I said, that's a 50-50 split. So our state government needs to agree every year when we go to our General Assembly session to buy new waivers. Once you get one, you keep it. But if we want to get more people on board with this program, we have to buy new waivers. And every time we do that, we then go back to the federal government and say, here's how many new waivers we want to buy. Still good with you? And the federal government says, yep, still good with us. And that's how new waivers come on board. So this is important as we talk about a little bit of the changes that have gone on with the waiver program. The reason the federal government has such a say is that they're picking up half the tab. All right, so waiver redesign. Virginia's Medicaid waiver program has been around since 1990 and was effectively unchanged in any substantial way until 2016. So if you encountered the program at all, any time between its start and then 2016, things now will seem a little bit different, and let's talk about that. So, as of now, Virginia has 5 waivers. The community living, family and individual supports, and building independence waivers are here separately. There are 3 developmental disability waivers, and I lump them together because the eligibility criteria is the same, the application process is the same, the waiting list is the same, almost all the services are the same, the management is the same. So in a lot of what we're talking about today, we'll discuss the differences, but functionally they're the same. They're one block. They're our developmental disability waivers that I'll call our DD waivers. There's also a Commonwealth Coordinated Care, or CCC Plus Waiver. And if you've known the EPSDT waiver in the past, it's that kind of reborn, if you will. And Virginia, just so you have the whole picture, also has an Alzheimer's assisted living waiver that we won't really be talking about today other than this slide. So, what we're going to do for pretty much everything we discussed today is go back and forth between our developmental disability waivers and our CCC Plus waivers. So for everything I talk about, understanding the waiver, eligibility, services, I'll go back and forth. Here's how you are eligible for this set of waivers, here's how you're eligible for that set of waivers, new topic, that kind of thing. And let's look at the reasons we're going to do that. So for the DD waivers, you must have a developmental disability diagnosis. And we'll talk in real concrete terms about what that means, but if you're in this room, you probably know someone who has a developmental disability. For the CCC Plus waiver, not only do you need that disability diagnosis, but you also have some kind of significant medical need. And again, we'll drill down into what that means. The DD waivers have a pretty robust menu of services for living in your parents' home, in your own home, for going to work, for kind of services across a lifespan. The CCC Plus waiver has a much shorter menu of services. It's defined by our federal contract as a nursing home diversion waiver, so it's the equivalent to services you get in a nursing home, so mostly nursing and home care. The DD waivers offer up to 24/7 support based upon need. The CCC Plus waivers has some pretty significant caps on the ways that you can get care hours. Our DD waivers have a case manager who will help you figure out what services you can get, not only through the waiver, but through the community and world at large, and help you put all these pieces together and come up with a plan. The CCC Plus waiver doesn't have that. So why on earth would I ever bother talking about this waiver that's more restrictive to get into and offers fewer services? And the answer is that our DD waivers has a very long waiting list, and our CCC Plus waivers have no waiting list at all. So the reason we talk about both of them is because for both of these you need a developmental disability. Here you also have to have some medical needs. So to give you a rough sense of it, at any point in time, about a third to a quarter of the people who are waiting on this very long waiting list are able to use this in the meantime. So it's a very significant portion of our population. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about that redesign that I mentioned in 2016. So before the redesign, we had 3 waivers for people with developmental disabilities, and after the redesign, we had 3 waivers for people with developmental disabilities, but they got all mixed up and rebranded and changed in the middle there, if you will. So in the old terms, we had a day support waiver, a DD waiver, and an ID waiver. And really these waivers offered various supports based upon your childhood IQ score. There wasn't a whole lot of flexibility, and so as a result of a legal settlement that we have with the Department of Justice and a lot of advocacy and other pressures, Virginia redesigned our waiver system, realizing that probably your IQ score when you were a child is not a great predictor of what you are going to need across your entire adult lifespan, right? So under our new system, we have a waiver called the Building Independence Waiver, and it's exclusively for adults, meaning over 18, and people who can live pretty independently. We know this is a relatively small minority of our DD population, but significant. And we're seeing more and more people who are ending up in this pool, people who need that waiver for just some drop-in services, maybe some services on a daily basis even, but probably not someone there every single second of the day, right? Our middle tier waiver is called the Family and Individual Supports Waiver, and this is where the overwhelming majority of our population is intended to fall. So this is people, children or adults, living in their own home or living in their parents' home. Really the criteria for this middle tier waiver is you need more than someone dropping in and less than someone awake and touching you 24 hours a day. So as you can imagine, that's most of us, right? And then our third waiver is our community living waiver, and this is the someone there awake constantly waiver. So for people who have very significant hands-on care needs, very significant medical or behavior needs, they tend to fall in this block over here. You are able to move between these 3 waivers. Bear in mind, this redesign is, as of this month, 24 months old. So people's ability to navigate and move back between them is just now being hammered out, and lots of kind of kinks are being ironed out. So would you ask me last year, what does this move look like? I would have said, slow and challenging. And if you ask me right now, what does this move look like? I would say, things are kind of picking up speed, and it looks like, if you ask me next year, I will be able to tell you relatively fluid. So we are kind of getting things going here. So the idea being, maybe you get the waiver as a child, you're living at home, you have some pretty significant needs. Maybe you graduate from school and you've built up some great life skills and you end up living on your own. And you've got a job with lots of supports and you've got staff checking in on you and you're using this waiver, and then maybe you age in place or you have a stroke or something significant happens in your life, and all of a sudden you need 24/7 staff, or you need a nurse, or you need some heavy duty services. Then you can move over here. Now, why on earth did we go from a 3-waiver system to a 3-waiver system instead of one that's all comprehensive? And the answer for that, despite a lot of my advocacy and griping, makes a lot of sense. So, the answer is, when we went and asked for new waivers to pare down on that waiting list and make some progress, the state would say, well, how much do you need for a new waiver? And we'd say, well, the number I have to give you is based upon the people who are using a waiver right now. And let's look at the people who are using waivers. 79% were well into adulthood, with another 7% over 65. A very small percentage were children, and a very small percentage were even teenagers or young 20s, right? So we can guess, looking at this wheel, older population, less likely to have parents providing a whole bunch of free support, more likely to need work services and residential services, right? We're more likely to have more needs as people aged in place. So when I was asking for new waivers, we had to give cost estimates for people who we knew were pretty expensive, despite the fact that the people on the waiting list were majority young children, with another about 15% teenagers. Only 1% over 65, about a third adults. So our budgeting was not at all in line with the services we were asking for, and it made advocacy really challenging. Because if every time you need $40,000 in services, you have to tell the state to budget for $70,000 in services, things go really, really slowly. So the concept of this redesign was, we should be able to have much better guesses about what someone who's over 18 and has limited access to services is going to need, and a much better way to budget for this person. And we know we're going to have some people who use literally hundreds of thousands of dollars of services a year, but we should have a very good sense of that's a relatively small number, here's what they look like, that's not the majority, that's not who we need to budget for all the time. So the hope is that this helps move our waiting list along and helps with budgeting and planning and all those kinds of things that states have to do. So that's the whole concept behind the DD waiver redesign. Long, complicated, we thought all this out. Here's the concept behind the EDCD redesign. One day we woke up and it had a new name. So there was the EDCD waiver that had been around for a long time, and about 30,000 people were served. And like I mentioned, you needed not only a disability, but also a medical need. There was the tech-assisted waiver that served about 300 people who had significant medical needs. So 30,000 and 300. And the state was running these programs where the population overlapped pretty much entirely and was spending a whole lot of money on administering two almost identical programs. And one day they said, this doesn't make a ton of sense. This has 99% of the services this does, this has 99% of the services this does. Let's just smoosh them together and call them the same thing and administer one program instead of two. And that's what they did. So if you had an EDCD waiver or heard about it, you probably still say, I have an EDCD waiver. There was no big rebranding, there was no outreach, there was no anything. Really, it's mostly just a name change with a very few services added, because this had a handful of services, this didn't, and this had a handful of services, this didn't. And when they smooshed them together, they just said, you know, you all can have it, right? It was just easier and more efficient for them to do that as a state. So when I talk about the CCC Plus Waiver, keep in the back of your mind, oh yeah, that used to be called the EDCD waiver, if that term is familiar to you. All right, so now we're going to talk about eligibility. And as promised, as I go through eligibility, I'll go back and forth between our DD waivers and our CCC Plus waiver. So all waivers have three prongs of eligibility: your diagnosis, your needs, and the money you got in the bank. So let's look at diagnosis. As promised, we're going to take a deeper dive here into what the state defines as a developmental disability. This is a whole lot of words to, in short, say, if before you were 22, we notice that there's a disability that's preventing you from doing all the things your typically developing peers are, you're likely going to qualify for this waiver on this diagnostic piece, right? So we're looking in 3 of 8 life areas. Do you have needs with taking care of yourself, communicating, being self-sufficient, managing money, those kinds of ways that we look at defining things. If you're a young child, meaning under age 9, we don't even need a really clear diagnosis, because for kiddos under age 9, sometimes we just don't have one. We're just waiting to see how their development tracks along. But if we're seeing some significant needs, you're likely to fall into this pool. This definition is significantly more flexible than the old definition before the redesign. So this is one of the good things that came out of that redesign. For our CCC Plus waiver, the diagnosis is a little unclear. So it's for people who have significant medical needs and some kind of disability. So the 30,000 people using this waiver, our DD population is about 10% of that 30,000. So we are the minority. Most people using this have aging-related disabilities and are well into adulthood, 65 plus kind of folks. So we are kind of tacking ourselves on to this nursing home diversion waiver, which is why it's not really custom tailored to people with disabilities. So significant medical needs is really the language that's used, and they talk about nursing needs. So anything that either a nurse does for your child, or parents or someone in your life were trained by a nurse or caregiver to do may qualify. So let's talk through some examples. So let's say your child sees a physical therapist for range of motion exercises and they need a kind of occupational therapy. They're likely to qualify. Let's say the parent does those range of motion exercises at home as prescribed by a physician. They very well may qualify, right? Because a parent had to be trained by a medical provider to do that. If your child has a G-tube or an NJ tube or any kind of feeding specialized supports, they are likely to qualify. If your child has sleep apnea or seizures that need some kind of significant ongoing monitoring, they are likely to qualify. So again, the criteria is a little bit gray. The standard is higher than my child just takes medication, like I hand them medication and then they take it, right? That alone won't qualify you. But if you're doing some kind of significant monitoring and support, and seizures are an easy example to look at, that may count. So even if your child doesn't seize on a routine basis, but you have been, are we just zoning out, or are we having a petit mal seizure, those kinds of things, you're seeing a neurologist on a routine basis just to keep up with things, that's likely to qualify you. So it's kind of the supports you're giving in the medical realm and the assessments you're doing in the medical realm that make the difference with qualifying for the CCC Plus waiver. A group who does some work with the waiver created this awesome self-assessment that's just a handful of questions, more than a handful, maybe a dozen or so questions, that you can do online, like multiple choice. Does your child need help with this? A little bit of help, a lot of help, all the help, right? Those kinds of things you can walk through, and it's not an application process for the waiver, but it's a very good way to get a sense of, are we likely eligible or not? It's a really, really fast, easy thing to do at home that'll give you a sense of, is this worth me pursuing or not? Okay. So now we'll look at functional eligibility. So for our DD waivers, we know we need a DD diagnosis. For our CCC Plus waiver, we know we need disability plus medical. For functional needs, our DD waivers use a test called the Virginia Individual Developmental Disability Eligibility Survey. Everyone's going to call it the VIDES for very obvious reasons, right? So this VIDES assessment has 3 versions. For infants, 0 to the day before you turn 3. Children, 3 to the day before you turn 18, and adults 18 plus. So meant to be developmentally appropriate, if you will. I'm more than happy to give copies of those surveys out to people. They're public documents. One of the things I like about the VIDES is on the very front page of the VIDES, there's the scoring guide for it. So you can take it yourself and score it yourself and have a very clear idea of whether or not you are likely to be eligible. And the other thing that's nice is you get a sense of how fragile the eligibility is. So you can say, you know, on this question I was kind of between sometimes you need help and most times you need help. And I can go back and see that makes the difference between whether or not we qualify in this category, right? It gives you a sense of how to best answer questions and prepare for things. So if you look through that survey and have questions about, you know, I'm not quite sure how to answer this, or do I talk about best days or worst days, those are the kinds of things you're welcome to contact us about. In general, I would say, be thinking about a tough day within the last year. Within the last year, because your answer should be current and accurate, and thinking about a tough day because that's what we need to be prepared to support with services, right? The CCC Plus waiver has a different functional test. It's called the Uniform Assessment Instrument, or UAI. There's a link to it here. It's focused more on medical needs. There's one medical section out of 8 on this test because this is a medical waiver. This has a lot of medical questions about therapies and doctors and providers and specialists and medications and all kinds of things. It doesn't have that handy dandy scoring guide on the front, but it is incredibly repetitive. So if you go for and go online and look at that UAI and score it yourself, you will get a sense of, do I often find myself saying yes to these questions, or do I not often find myself saying yes to these questions? And doing that ahead of time, plus that self-assessment I mentioned on the last slide, is a really good way to get yourself prepared for applying for that waiver. Financial eligibility is the same for both waivers, and it's different than if you just walked in to your county Department of Social Services and applied for Medicaid. It's long-term care Medicaid, which has special rules because waivers provide long-term care, not just short-term health insurance. So the monthly income cap is higher than it is for qualifying for regular Medicaid. People who use waivers, the waiver user themselves, can earn up to $2,313, and that's the 2019 amount, per month, and that's adjusted for inflation over time. It's tied to Social Security adjustments. Once someone is earning more than, in today's dollars, $1,237 a month, they start to have a copay for some of their waiver services. But if the person with a disability has an income lower than this, their waiver cost is $0. There's a $2,000 resource limit for adults, so that means if you're an adult using a waiver, you cannot have more than $2,000 in your checking account, savings account, stocks and bonds that grandparents gave you, all those kinds of things all put together. There's not a resource limit for children because children don't own property, right? They're not legally able to do that. And parent income and resources never count. In 2017, our state government said, what would it be like if we did count parent income and resources? Because the state was looking to pinch pennies. There hasn't been any fallout from that yet. I only give it as a little side note that this is all very much true today. That doesn't mean it's necessarily true for all eternity. Okay, so applying for Medicaid, and this is something quirky about Virginia's system. If you have applied for waiver, have you also applied for Medicaid? And the answer is no. Because often when you're applying for the waiver, you're applying and you're going to be put on a waiting list. And you don't get that Medicaid until the time that you actually get to use waiver services. And then they say, all right, we'll let you in the back door to Medicaid now. You can use these special rules and now you can go ahead and start using your Medicaid. So just know that what the point at which you get a Medicaid waiver, either because you were on a waiting list or because you applied for a waiver with no waiting list, then your next step is going to be to get that Medicaid in place to pay for all the services you're going to get. Financial eligibility is important for understanding household income should never be a deterrent. All of the income and asset questions are about the person with a disability themselves. So no matter what family income and assets are, they will never disqualify someone with a disability from using a waiver. There are people in poverty who use waivers. There are people whose families are millionaires who use waivers. All right, I mentioned the $2,000 asset cap for adults. The legal and ethical way around that is a special needs trust or an ABLE account. Those are just essentially special savings vehicles that allow the person with a disability to save more than that $2,000 or own more than that $2,000 without disqualifying themselves from Medicaid and Waiver and Social Security and all these programs that have that ridiculously low cap. We have a special needs trust at our office. It's been around for many decades. Tia does lots of free presentations and consultations, a number of them here. It's worth thinking about. And just as a little note in the back of your mind, plenty of parents say like, well, my child doesn't need any money now or doesn't have any money now in their name. We don't foresee a time that that's the case. About 20%, I think, of the trusts that we have set up with our office have no money in them and are essentially a shell. So that life insurance policies, grandma's will, parents' end-of-life documents, whatever it is, can be written to say this money is going to the special needs trust for the exclusive benefit of Samantha Smith, instead of to Samantha Smith. And all of a sudden, Samantha has all this money, and people are saying, wait, I don't know if you're eligible for all your programs anymore. So it's there to kind of catch things and be a future planning vessel, even if you don't have money to put in it now. So we are going to talk about services. And to give you a little bit of a sense of it, these columns are our 3 developmental disability waivers. So our community living waiver, that waiver for people with the highest level of need. Our family and individual support waiver for people, our majority of people who have less than super duper needs and more than teeny weeny needs. And our building independence waiver that's for adults who are pretty independent. On the far column here is the CCC Plus waiver. And remember way back in the beginning I said it has a pretty limited number of services. You'll see that here. So when we look at residential services, all 3 of our developmental disability waivers offer some kind of residential service, and the spectrum of that varies based upon the people they're supposed to be serving. So our community living waiver offers residential services that are meant to be 24/7 awake staff, more robust hands-on supports, because we're supposed to be serving people with more robust needs. So this is everything from very traditional group homes, like usually 4 to 7-ish people who don't know each other are put in a house together. Staff are hired to be there in a week, and they rotate in on staff 24 hours a day. For some people, it's a good model. For a lot of people, it's not super flexible and customized, and it's not a tremendous fit for them. I'm trying to imagine myself being thrown into a home with 5 brand new friends who I don't know, who have different ages and sexes and interests and schedules and behaviors and all kinds of quirks than I do, and being told, like, now you all just get along and we're going to bring a bunch of staff in that you don't choose, right? So I worked in group homes for a while, and some of them work beautifully. I mean, not even just the services of the provider, but sometimes people just mesh really well, right? Sometimes you get that in college assigned roommate and you guys are just best buds, and sometimes you get a freshman college roommate. It's not a good fit for you, right? So the state is trying to move away from the over-reliance on this model, because especially as we have younger people coming up, this is way less desired. And not quite what we thought it was going to be. So we're moving towards more services like shared living, where a person with a disability lives with someone without a disability. So it could be a sibling or a family friend, or it could be someone you hire. That person's there for overnight eyes and ears. They're probably sleeping, like most people are overnight, but if a fire alarm goes off, someone knocks on the door, someone screams out in pain, they're there. to be of help. And then you can bring additional services in on top of that, which is why that waiver works for people who have very low needs to very high needs. This is kind of one of the pieces that you would put in place. There's independent living, which is effectively drop-in supports, a few hours a day kind of thing. A sponsored residential service where the person with a disability moves in with a paid caregiver, and that caregiver really is their 24/7 staff, awake overnight if they need it. A very much kind of small family sort of centered model that a lot of people have an interest in. And there's supported living, which can be up to 24/7 staff or a little bit less. Usually in a supported living model, there's like 2-ish people living together, often who have the opportunity to choose each other in advance. And note, our CCC Plus waiver has got nothing in this column. There really is no kind of residential equivalent. Now we're going to take a look at day and employment services. And note that our 3 DD waivers effectively offer all of the kinds of things in the employment realm. And our CCC Plus waiver, again, does not offer anything. Because people in a nursing home are not usually receiving employment services. This is a nursing home diversion waiver, right? So our employment spectrum is changing pretty rapidly. The 2016 redesign said, okay, here are new rules, and here's new funding to put these things in place, and then all of our private providers have been scrambling to say, okay, now I have to read and understand all these rules and retrain my staff and change my business model. And I think that's hit the day and employment sector harder than any of the other pieces of the waiver. So this is the piece that I would say is like kind of most in flux and evolving after the 2016 redesign. In a nutshell, historically Virginia, just like we've relied really heavily on group homes, relied really heavily on day support, which often was a lot of people with disabilities go to a large building with a lot of paid staff from 9 to 3, Monday through Friday, and they engage in activities about learning or life skills, or they may get paid for some piecemeal work, and then they left at the end of the day. The Department of Justice said, wow, Virginia, you rely really heavily on this model. And as it turns out, you were billing for a lot of people in a pre-vocational category who have been there for 30 years. When does the vocation come? They've been in pre-vocational services for 30 years. We need a better way to move people toward broader spectrum of supports and employment. So under the new system, kind of give you a rough idea of how we're trying to get things working. That maybe someone with a developmental disability leaves school, and 2 days of work, they are going to go to a day program. They're going to work with friends, that are going to develop some life skills and do some therapeutic kinds of supports. And maybe 1 day a week, they're going to go out and use this community engagement skill to go learn to navigate the public transit system where they are and start to learn to do that with or without a care attendant, right? Learn to get themselves around a little bit on their own. And maybe 1 day a week, they're going to go to a supported employment environment where there's supportive staff there and they're helping them learn to do a job and they're getting paid real wages to do it. And then maybe 1 day a week, they have one-on-one community coaching who's there to break down a very significant barrier we're having to being more independent. Maybe it's that transportation is scary. Maybe it's we're seeing a behavior when a certain kind of stimulus is around. They're going to work one-on-one in a really intense way to try and work through that or find other kinds of solutions. So we are meant to be working toward a system where instead of choosing one service, and then in order to go to employment, you need to be totally ready to make the move to independent employment, that you could kind of mix and match and move yourself over and choose different things that are helping you build skills over time and flex with you. That's the general idea. Again, kind of, we're really in the rollout stages of this. Now we're going to talk about services you can have in your home, and by that I mean services in the home of the person with a disability if they're living with or without mom or dad. So here we finally see our CCC Plus waiver get on the map. So in-home services, someone who comes to the house and focuses on skill building. Companion services, someone who's there really just for safety monitoring, and mostly be out of the way if the person just needs someone around. Respite services, so maybe you have a set number of care hours every single week when you usually have staff there, but there's a week when school's out on break, mom and dad are, heaven forbid, taking a vacation, or have a work trip, or you need a little bit of extra support, then you'd say, I'm just going to pull some of those respite hours over to plug some holes that we have in our usual schedule. Environmental modifications, which are changes to the house or car to make it more adapted to the person with a disability. So that can be physical adaptations like widening doorways or putting in ramps, or safety adaptations, things like if someone has a tendency to kick out windows, putting in plexiglass windows, or if someone has a tendency to open the door and run out into the street, keypads on the doorknobs that require you enter a code before you leave the house. Those kinds of things. All right. So now we're going to talk about some other kinds of community-based supports, and again, notice our 3DD waivers offer a whole lot, our CCC Plus Waiver offers a little smidgy. Electronic home-based supports are a part of the Waiver Redesign. Smart homes is trademarked, but that's the kind of idea behind this. Stoves that can automatically shut themselves off after a certain period of time. If someone with cerebral palsy is in their bed and they don't need overnight staff, except for to let the morning staff person in, a camera and buzzer by their bed so they can let the morning staff person in. All kinds of ways of allowing people to be more independent, and also recognizing that some of our folks on the autism spectrum and with other disabilities for that matter, take prompts better from electronic devices than from people, right? Timers going off, checklists, monitors that check whether or not someone got into the shower that day and for how long, all those kinds of things that are very, very cool. Assistive technology is available under all of the waivers. That's up to $5,000 a year for portable devices. So most commonly requested items are things like iPads with communication software, but it can be other kinds of things that are portable to help the person with a disability be more adapted or independent. Crisis supports both in your home and in an out-of-home respite placement if someone's having a very significant either medical or behavioral or mental health crisis. Transition services to help people leave institutional settings, so things like nursing homes, not transition from high school. And then there's some caregiver training that's available. All right, so one quick note about waiver services. So for all those services I talked about being in your home, your companion and your respite and your personal care and your skill building, you generally have the choice between agency-directed services, in which case you hire a care agency and you tell them, all right, Sally Smith Care Agency, I need you here Monday through Friday from 3 to 9 p.m. I need you here Saturday on these hours. And I need to make sure that if that staff person calls out, you're doing your very best to send another kind of person, and you all are going to do all the hiring and firing and timesheets and whatever, and I'm just going to tell you what we need. So the good thing is a lot of the work is taken off the family, but with that you lose a lot of the control and choice. So some people prefer a model where you do what's called consumer-directed services. So the family says, I either know someone I want to hire, a sibling, cousin, grandparent, neighbor, family friend, teacher aide, whoever, or I want to find that person based upon criteria I select, and the waiver is going to pay for them. So I'll be the employer, like I'll sign off on their timesheets, but the waiver is going to process those timesheets, and the waiver is going to pay that person. And the waiver is going to effectively be the co-employer with me. They're going to do all that HR kind of paperwork sort of thing. And some people blend them and say, you know, there are sometimes I just absolutely, no matter what, have to find someone. I don't always have the energy, but maybe on weekends or some evenings a week when we're home and we can be our own backup if someone calls out, we use this service. So people blend the two. All right, now we're going to talk about applying, and again, we'll go back and forth between our DD waivers and our CCC Plus waivers. So for all of the developmental disability waivers, screenings are conducted by your local community services board. So you will call them and say, I would like to be screened for one of the developmental disability waivers. And they will say, I'm sending you a big old packet of paperwork. You'll fill out that paperwork and you'll send back proof of the developmental disability, like a psychological evaluation, things like that. And they'll say, okay, this all looks good. Come in and do that vibes survey that we talked about, where we look at your 8 life areas, we see if you have significant needs, those kinds of things. And then they'll say, great, looks like you're eligible. Now let's talk about putting you on a waiver. For the CCC Plus waiver, you're calling your local Department of Social Services, here's a number for Loudoun, and right there on the phone, they'll do a screening. So if you start this phone call, I would say budget 45 minutes, give or take, for this phone call to happen. And right there on the phone, they're going to ask you a lot of questions about medical support needs and hands-on care needs. So if you are the kind of person who does better, making sure you have all those things out in front of you, I would say make sure you have a list of all the doctors and therapies and things that are prescribed and going on in this person's life, especially if you have needs that you don't often have to deal with. Maybe, for example, you have those seizures that you're monitoring for a lot, but it may not freshly come to your mind because you're so used as a parent to just monitoring and doing those assessments. We don't see a whole lot of seizures, you don't give yourself credit for it. Make sure you have all those kinds of things at hand. Just kind of self-prompt you as they're asking you the questions on the phone. If that phone screening goes well, they will send out a nurse, and the nurse will ask you essentially the same exact questions in person. And she will say, great, it sounds like you were eligible for this waiver. We're now going to help you apply for Medicaid, and you're going to start getting services, because this waiver, remember, has no waiting list at all. So, for our DD waiver that does have a waiting list, we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into that here. Our DD waivers have a shared waiting list. And waiting time is unpredictable because it's based upon urgency of need. And as you can imagine, that's constantly in flux. So some people ask a lot, if there's a waiting list, why would I bother to get on it? We know we're not going to be at the top of it right now. Well, it's because sometimes you have a situation where one day you're not at the top of the waiting list and the next day something happens to your family, maybe a parent passes away, has a significant medical change, maybe the child with a disability all of a sudden has a big ramp up in behaviors when puberty and hormones go, hey, and all of a sudden we need services a whole lot more urgently than we used to. You want to be in a place where you are already on this list and ready to just make a phone call saying, hey, we're now way more urgent than we used to be. The local community services board, so in this case the Loudoun community, managing that waiting list. And whenever new slots for the waiver, that's what they're called, waiver slots, come available because our state government funded more of them, our federal government gave it the thumbs up, right? We've got new waivers coming along. They convene a group of volunteers who look at the people at the top of the urgency list and they say, all right, volunteers, you to sit together and try and come up with a list of who you think most needs waiver services. So that is a clue that if you're on that waiver waiting list, you want to make sure they always have your most up-to-date information. If you want to write a letter, if you think, the things that you're asking me about this waiting list are not really capturing the essence of why I feel like we urgently need services, you can write a letter. If your doctor wants to write a letter, if you want to add any kinds of supplemental information, you can put all of that in the file for this whole group to consider when they're assigning waiver slots and services. A question I get asked sometimes is like, what if there's a true emergency? What if my husband and I are hit by a bus tomorrow or all of a sudden the world explodes? There are some waivers set aside for those emergency kind of situations. Both caregivers are suddenly out of the picture or adult or child protective services are significantly involved with someone. But for the most part, everyone's navigating the waiting list. And on that waiting list, there are 3 priorities. Priority 1, and the state uses this awful teasing terminology, I think, that says means you need services within a year. We're not promising to give them to you on any time frame, but we know that you need them within a year, right? Priority 2 may require services in 1 to 5 years, and this is where the bulk of people on the waiting list lie. So not super duper urgent in need. We don't maybe have a parent with their own complications. We don't have multiple children with disabilities in the house. We're not on the brink of homelessness or transitioning out of school with no supports. Here are all kinds of things that can put you over here. But things are challenging, right? We're holding it together as best we can. And priority 3 is generally for people who have pretty young kids, who are pretty healthy and doing pretty well, and things are pretty stable, and they would benefit from waiver services, but they're doing okay without them now. And just like with our waivers, you can move between these 3 categories kind of based upon your urgency of need. So anytime you call up the Community Services Board, you can ask, and they should, like that, be able to tell you which of these 3 priority tiers you're in. And you can always supply information that would move you between these tiers or up inside these tiers, right? So, the waiting list. There are about 13,000 people waiting for these developmental disability waivers at this moment in time. This year, our state government funded services for 543 of those people. Next year, they are scheduled to fund services for about another 1,000 of those people. Could be, it's a state budget. They could end up changing their mind and doing a little bit more, a little bit less. We'll be pushing for them to do a little bit more. But to give you a rough sense of it, this 543 plus next year's 1,000 is half of the priority 1 waiting list. That's way more progress than we have made in the 2 years, in a 2-year bundle in a lot of recent years. So another good reason to be on the waiver waiting list is sometimes it goes much faster than other times. You want to make sure, even though some years things seem to be going really slowly, that you're on that waiting list and as high up on that waiting list as you can be, because sometimes we go really far down on it to serve people, or much farther than we do in other years. If you're on the waiting list, as we talked about, if you have medical needs, you can also apply to use that CCC Plus Waiver, right? It gives you a little bit of a lifeline support. You can always call your county case manager and ask about local dollars. Loudoun, Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax sometimes have some local dollars that they can use to support families in very limited sorts of situations, but it's always worth the ask. There are grant programs. So the Department of Justice settlement I alluded to a few times also mandated that we offer something to people on the waiting list. And the way that Virginia chose to implement that is every year people on the waiting list can apply for up to $1,000 in funding. It's really help because of their disability. It's very broad. The things that are most often requested are things like respite and summer camp. A lot of people use it to pay for Jill's house in this area. Excuse me. But you can ask for help with medical co-pays and adaptive equipment and job coaches and all kinds of interesting and creative things that are related to the person with a disability. The application is pretty short and simple, and it opens every year. The application is open right now, so if you're already on the waiting list, you can apply now through November 8th, but it's first come, first served, so I would say go quickly. And ask for up to $1,000 in supports. And as I mentioned, there are crisis services under the waiver. There are also crisis services available for people on the waiting list. So you can call and say, hey, we don't have a waiver, but we are having a very significant behavioral crisis in my house right now. Can you please come here and try and help us? Or we are having such a significant behavioral crisis that we feel like this person needs to reboot and be out of the home for a few days. Can they go to the crisis respite home? And that's available. So if your loved one with a disability is someone who also has a mental health or behavior kind of need, and you think, I can see us making one of those calls one day, it's a great idea to just do an intake and screening with them, so that at the point you need services, you're just calling and saying, hey, it's John Smith, come on out, instead of, hey, you don't know me, but we've got all these things going on, and we're wondering if we could have an assessment real quick here on the phone, and you could start to come out. So that's a much better way to get things going.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
The IFSP.
Yeah.
Do I already have to be on one of these waiting lists?
To apply, so you could apply next year if you go to get on the waiting list now.
So there's no way I'll qualify for one if I started the ball today.
Exactly.
By November 8th, 2018, correct?
The bureaucracy just moves too slow.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Very, very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about managed care, which is one of those intersecting pieces with waivers. It's not technically a waiver, but big changes are going on that are affecting waiver users. This is very classic Virginia Medicaid. So in 2017, they renamed our EPSDT waiver that we talked about our CCC Plus Waiver. They launched a managed care program and called it CCC Plus. And I thought,
Why?
hi, did you do this? And they made this like little joke, like, isn't that so silly and ridiculous? And I was like, yes. There was a terrible plan. So I tried very hard to say CCC Plus Waiver, because that's one thing. That's your bundle of waiver services, your care attendant in your home. And CCC Plus Managed Care, which is really this kind of bureaucratic back-end takeover of Medicaid. So we'll walk through that a little bit. We have an online resource library, and the website is listed here, and there are, I think, copies of the handout still available too, where we have handouts just on CCC Plus and selecting a plan and understanding your choices and walking through all of that. But I want to give you a little bit of a look at it right now. So historically speaking, if someone got a waiver, they'd shop that waiver around for the things they needed. So let's say they needed a personal care attendant and they hired John Smith's home care agency. Then John Smith would say, all right, Medicaid, I've got a new person. I'm going to ask for support hours for them. I'm going to send them a bill. Right? And that's how it worked. Person, provider, Medicaid. Things kind of went back and forth between those three bodies. Managed care inserts another party into that line. And now, instead of John Smith's agency being enrolled with Medicaid and asking Medicaid for payment, they have to contract with a managed care agency. And Virginia Medicaid said, I don't want to do any of that anymore. I don't want to authorize services. I don't want to write monthly checks for services. I want to hand off all those pieces. We'll still write the rules. We'll still ultimately pay for things and be the big boss, but we don't want to be doing all that in the weeds day-to-day work. And this is part of a huge national trend that's aimed at saving a lot of state dollars, getting right, so you're no longer employing state staff to do this, you're hiring contractors to do it effectively. So if you are using one of the CCC Plus waivers, remember old EDC, your tech waiver, essentially everything you've got has been moved over to managed care. All of your medical services, so your doctor's visits, your therapies, your pharmacies, all that kind of thing, plus your waiver services as of December of last year. So all your waiver services have to be authorized through this managed care organization. All of your providers have to be authorized through this managed care organization. Things are more challenging than they were just because you got another person who's got hands in the pot. The only thing not moved to managed care are people who are totally ineligible for it. There's a few groups of people who are ineligible for managed care, but in the DD realm, there's only one group that has any kind of significant numbers, and those are people who are enrolled in a program called HIP. And HIP is a program that you can use if you both have Medicaid insurance and either through your own employer or your parents' employer insurance. And it's roughly cash assistance to pay for some kinds of things. There's a lot more information. I'll go back here. In this resource library I mentioned, there's also tons more information about HIP. I don't want to go too far down that road, but generally speaking, pretty much all CCC Plus Waiver users, everything you've got is now enrolled in managed care. For the DD waivers, all of people's Medicaid services, so all of your doctors and therapists and pharmacies, etc., are enrolled in this managed care organization, and you've got to go through this other body to get things authorized, but your waiver services are not now. And if you look at the contract, the way that it's written with the managed care organizations, it effectively says, until the redesign of the waivers is complete, we're not turning that over to managed care organizations. When is the redesign complete? Interesting question. So this happened on paper in 2016, right? Here we are 2 years later, and like I talked about, employment services are still being fleshed out, all kinds of things are happening. There's no real hard criteria in that contract, so it could be any day now we get a notice that your waiver services are being moved over to managed care and this other group is going to be authorizing them and funding them, or it could be years from now, right? So that's not really hard and fast. There are 6 managed care plans in Virginia, so people every year choose to enroll in one of these 6. You can keep the one that you have, or every year you have a chance to change that plan. Like I mentioned, we have some stuff on our online resource library, some tips on how to select the best plan for you and navigate between the plans, those kinds of things. We don't, as of yet, have a ton of historical data on how much people are liking these plans, because it really only started in March of this year, so 7 months ago, that people were fully enrolled in this system and up and running with it. And with any kind of rollout, we moved 250,000 Medicaid users across the state over to managed care. Anytime you move that many people in that many services, there are going to be all kinds of kinks. So some of those initial kinks are getting ironed out, and we really encourage families who have experiences, good, bad, or ugly, with managed care to keep us updated, and those are the kinds of things we keep in our information bank. When other families call and ask questions, and we say, you know, we heard stories about this, we heard that this is going well. As a kind of rough idea, Anthem Health Keepers is far and away the most commonly selected provider in Northern Virginia by many, many, many fold. The next most common is United, followed by Aetna, and then the other 3 have a few thousand people in Northern Virginia. Yeah?
If you get a chance to provide feedback to them, and last year before they went to like CCC Plus, they had Kaiser in the Medicaid, and somehow Kaiser was great.
Yeah.
And
Kaiser's not enrolled.
I know, it's not anymore. I mean, is there any way to add it back to the list?
Yes, theoretically, if the next time they put out a request for proposals for people to enroll in managed care, if Kaiser bids on that, yes. It is possible that that could happen in the future, just as much as these plans could fade away or add back in or whatnot. So I'm going to touch very quickly on this other kind of intersecting piece with Medicaid, or waivers, which is about this CIS. Good God. So once you receive a Medicaid waiver, every 2 years if you're a child or 3 years as an adult, you sit down for this very, very, very long meeting, and you take the supports intensity scale, or CIS assessment. It's a long version of the VIBE. We're asking you lots of questions about the support you need on a daily basis. Again, long, long, long kind of meeting. It's going to leave you with a numeric score. Call it your CIS score. And the state has divided people with those scores into one of 7 levels, effectively ranging from you need very few supports to a whole lot of supports, and everything in between. When the state looked at the data for people who were using waivers, they found just about 7% of people fell into that lowest tier, very few needs. This is the population the state is expecting to be using that building independence waiver, give or take, right? People living on their own, adults, pretty independent. About 80% of people, if you add these 2 tiers together, fell somewhere in the like mild, moderate, high, but not complicated needs kind of realm. This is the population, give or take, the state's expecting to use that family and individual supports or middle tier waiver. and just under 15% of our population fell into the really high need category. Complicated behaviors, complicated medical needs, really intense hands-on care needs. These are the folks the state's expecting to use that community living waiver. It's not hard and fast that if you fall into one of these categories, that's the only waiver you can use, but you can get a sense that that's how the state's trying to plan it and budget and move things forward in the future. In general, your SIS score matters because if you're in any kind of group setting for work or for living, the higher your support need is, the more complicated you are, the more people are paid to support you. That makes intuitive sense, right? If you have someone who needs a nurse, we should be paying them more per hour than someone who does not need a nurse, because nurses are expensive. However, if you are in a really large setting, you are paid less. So, the idea being there, maybe you've got 8 people who need a nurse. Well, if you have them all on the same employment site, you only need to hire 1 nurse. Whereas if you had 2 people who needed a nurse and you needed a nurse there, you know you're spreading your cost over fewer people. So there's kind of this intersection, if you will, between complications of the person and size of the group that determines how much the provider is paid to serve you. And the idea here is to incentivize providers to serve the full range of people. We'll pay you more if you got someone who's got more needs, but we'll pay you more for everybody if you've got them in smaller groups. Again, with the recognition that smaller groups are where people tend to be happiest and best served. So, this is the last kind of random intersection with Medicaid waivers I'm going to talk about, and it's EPSDT. And let's break that down a little bit, and this is very fresh. EPSDT stands for Early Periodic Screening, Diagnosis, and Treatment. And if you remember that, you'll be the only person who does. No one ever says that. Everyone says EPSDT, or often just those letters in a different order jumbled up, and then like, you know what I mean, ETPS, you know the thing. So, early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment is the same idea as early intervention services, just on a longer timeline. And this is a federal mandate. So again, understanding our Medicaid is an intersection with the federal government. Federal mandate, all states have some version of this program. Essentially meaning if you are under 21 years old and you have Medicaid, we're going to give you more supports and more access to services than if you were over 21. Again, same idea as early intervention. If we help you out more when you are younger, our hope is that you will need a little bit less when you are older. So, let's look at some of those EPSDT services. And this is not new. This has been around for many, many, many years. EPSDT services can offer additional medical support services, additional therapeutic services. A lot of people who have the waiver use their EPSDT to get ABA services, for example, speech and medical therapists, all those kinds of things. Home health services, medical equipment, things like hearing aids, vision, dental supports, things that are generally very hard to get with any insurance and even with Medicaid, you can get through EPSDT, because for kiddos under 21, we're trying to add in the supports that they get, again, hoping that as they age, they'll need a little bit less. EPSDT is not new. The reason that we are talking about it so much more is that last year for DD waiver users, and just this year, September 1st, a month and a half ago, for CCC Plus Waiver users, something changed. When we were redesigning our waivers, and we were saying to the federal government, you know, we share the cost on this, we've got to ask for your permission before we change things, here's how we do things, and everybody who has a waiver asks Medicaid for services, they said, well, what about kids who are under 21? And they said, we do the same for them. They said, you should not. That is not the rule. The rule is, if someone can access EPSDT, meaning if someone in Virginia is under 21 and has Medicaid, you should be billing EPSDT programs instead of waiver. And Virginia got their hand slapped for not having done this. So this is now all fallout from us trying to get all our ducks back in a row. There are 3 EPSDT services that overlap with waiver services. So those 3 services are personal care, private duty nursing, and assistive technology. This is so incredibly important because essentially anybody I know who uses a waiver uses this personal care, right? This is the most commonly used and authorized services. One-on-one staff person who's coming to your house, helping you do things at home, helping you do things out in your community. Like, this is the core waiver service. And all of a sudden they have said, if you're under 21, yeah, it's a waiver service, but you can't ask for it through waiver. You have to ask for it through EPSDT. And that means a doctor has to fill out a form. Doctors were never involved in Medicaid waivers before. It was between you and your Medicaid contractors and you sort of things out. So now this means a doctor or a nurse practitioner, or a few other people in your life, have to fill out a form about your personal care needs. How much help does this person need bathing and dressing and using the restroom and doing all these kinds of things that doctors may not normally be asking the people that they see. Those kinds of things. With nursing, they have to fill out a form that scores the hours of nursing they may need based upon very specific needs and supports that they have. And assistive technology, again, and doctors now having to write a letter before you can get your communication device and all those kinds of things. So if you have a CCC Plus waiver now, this change took effect on September 1st, but it won't affect you until you go to get your services reauthorized the next time. But first time after September 1st you go to do this, they're going to say, wait, do you have your additional paperwork from the doctor? Because we have to get that form filled out and returned and submitted and go through things a little bit in a different way. And so I would just allot a little bit more time to do that. I know with my children's pediatrician, I need to allot at least like a week between the time that they fill that out and get that back to me. So bear in mind, you've got to do that, and then you have to get that form back to your service facilitator, whoever's helping you with the waiver, so I would allot a few more days for that, and to get that submitted. So it's a pretty significant change. We've added another layer of complication that really falls back on the family to go navigating with this doctor and get all this kind of paperwork filled out. Here's another hurdle with EPSDT. If you are only using personal care, like I said, right, that's what most people are using, right? You're just using this caregiver who comes to your house, and now you're only getting that service authorized and billed for through EPSDT. The waiver computer system starts to say, this person's not using a waiver anymore. We're not being billed for anything. They're not asking for waiver services. Well, that's silly, right? You're using the same services you did before. They're just having to be paid for by this different backdoor program. But the waiver computer system starts to say, this person doesn't need a waiver anymore. We're going to kick them off the waiver because they're not using it. So, here's the workaround to that. The legal and ethical workaround, but here's what the state said. This is how you manage that. Make sure you're using a waiver service at least every 90 days if you have a DD waiver, or every 30 days if you have a CCC Plus waiver. And an example of a waiver service that's not affected by this change is respite care. So for example, if you have a caregiver who comes to your house 15 hours a week, at least one of those hours every single month, have them write respite on their timesheet. That alone keeps queuing the waiver system. This person's using the waiver. Things are humming right along. They're not using a whole lot. How great that they're only using 1 hour, but it doesn't matter. They're still using it. They can still keep their waiver. But make sure you get in the habit of doing that, because that's what kind of keeps your waiver alive and in use. Remember, you get 480 hours of respite over the course of the year, and some families have become really accustomed to using that like during one big block during the summer, for example, when school was out or things like that. So if you are one of those families, start thinking, I need to save at least one of those hours set aside every single month so I can continue to show that we're still using our waiver. I haven't yet talked to anyone who lost their waiver for this reason. Remember, this happened for DD waiver users last year. But you could certainly run into hairy situations, and if you are not very active in fixing those hairy situations, you could lose your waiver. So I don't want to terrify you, I just want to make you a little bit scared that this could happen, right? And to have it on your radar. Before anyone is denied EPSDT services, Medicaid is supposed to give a special look at that and say, like, what's going on? This person obviously had waiver and had these services before. Is there a reason the EPSDT system in particular is hosing them up? And it could happen. I haven't talked to anybody yet to whom this has happened. Medicaid's trying to fix it on the front end, but again, those are the kinds of calls and questions and things we troubleshoot every day. So, where do you go for more information? The state has a waiver hotline and a waiver website. We have a waiver web page that we try and keep updated. Like I mentioned, we have a resource library. We have all kinds of things. You all are recording this. Like I mentioned, this is complicated and I talk fast.